Welcome back to the LDRship Podcast, where our disagreements inform your decisions. If you're enjoying our discussion so far, please like and subscribe and share us with your family and friends. We do this because we love it, but we'd also like to think that maybe we're doing something useful in this world today. As we're recording this tonight, we are just a few weeks away from the 2024 presidential election, and of the many announcements that President-elect Trump has made, one in particular that has not only been repeated by him, but also echoed over the past several decades by many Republicans, is the desire to abolish the Department of Education. So tonight, we'll be discussing what the role of the federal government should be in education in this country. And because he is our resident Republican, we'll go ahead and start with Brett tonight to speak on his thoughts on the Republicans' plan.
So, hey, everybody. So my take on it is, because I apologize, I didn't look up the Republican platform for this, so I don't have their standpoint fully on the Department of Education for that. But my general thoughts around it is that I don't know as we need to abolish the Department of Education. It is in great need of reform, though. As Thea pointed out during one of our conversations, I think last week, my initial response is give it back to the states. That's kind of the whole point of being the United States of America. People tend to forget that we are actually, 50 separate entities that all kind of play together, but we do things differently. But I do think that the federal government should still have a role, right? But not necessarily to set standards per se, but to, kind of put out like priorities, setting like national wide priorities without the mandates, right? So that way the federal government could outline broad educational priorities, such as promoting STEM or, improving literacy, things like that. But this way you're not doing like top down mandates for the states. That way the states still have kind of the control that they have over that. I think the other thing the federal government could do from that standpoint would make sure that they're collaborating between the states, facilitating that to where they can be a sounding board or place where states can share their best practices, any resources, strategies that they have that are working. Because that's the point of being able to do collaboration, right? Is that people can talk to each other and we can find out, okay, what's working over here, what's not working here, and we share ideas that we can improve upon. And another area I think that they would be beneficial to take would be like support for military families. If there's any, and I do apologize, I keep clearing my throat. I'm kind of dealing with some symptoms this week and clearing off that. But in terms of doing like military family or, DOD type education for areas that don't have access to local schools here in the continental US, but then also maybe for tribal nations. I don't know as the government should fully handle that. But maybe they can help to facilitate it. So, I see, there's just kind of some of the areas that I think the government would be beneficial to still have some very low key oversight. But for the most part, it needs to go back to the states. It all kind of comes down to the fact that people know best for their communities what's needed. Even just here on this podcast, we represent 4 geographical regions in the U.S. I'm in Ohio, Dion's in Virginia, Will's down in Florida, and Thea's in California. All right. So we have different areas. There's different needs that come with that, and the education goes along with it. And so it's kind of one of those when you fall under the guise of central planning, you can't know the needs of everybody. And so when you can get it down to a lower level, I think you're going to end up with a higher quality education overall, especially if we are talking to each other. Like I said, that collaboration standpoint. But anyway, that's kind of my general standpoint. I'm sure we'll get a chance to discuss this a bit more.
All right, let's hear from either Will or Thea, because I'm sure one or both of you is in favor of keeping the Department of Education.
You want to go, Thea?
Sure. I'm in favor of keeping the Department of Education. I think what troubles me, I looked up, let me pull it up. I looked up earlier the mission of the Department of Education, just so we're to establish a baseline. So it says the Education Department's mission is to promote student achievement and preparation for global competitiveness by fostering educational excellence and ensuring equal access. So that's the mission. And then when I was looking up on their website, the types of things that the Department of Education does, I saw, it reminded me, the Department of Education is involved with student loan programs and the whole process for people applying for student loans and filling out the FAFSA. So to figure out what students are eligible for different financial aids at public universities, or actually it's, I guess, public and private, but primarily public universities around the country. It talks about different education programs, funding programs, providing funding for special education programs and special needs students, as well as then trying to assist with establishing like baseline curriculums, right? And different programs that encourage school districts to have not necessarily what the curriculum is, but to at least try to promote and I would say promote certain different programs that, based on, I think the science, from what I can tell, or studies of different areas where there may need to be improvements or where we're seeing trends across the country. What I didn't find when I was like looking up articles is that the Department of Education dictating how, any type of like, this is the exact curriculum that needs to be taught at any level of education. I didn't see where the Department of Education seems to have like a big brother overreach when it comes to how schools are run. I think from what I can tell, or from what I've experienced, I have 2 school-age kids, but also just kind of looking online, trying to educate myself, it seemed as though schools really are localized, right? Even within cities, school districts typically are smaller municipalities than even cities are, right? And a lot of what happens in individual schools is going to be decided at their school district level and at the local level. Additionally, we know schools are funded for sure at the local level, primarily through property taxes, So I guess what troubles me is I don't understand what the issue is with the Department of Education itself and what it actually does. So my feeling has, when it comes to this idea that we want to abolish this department, it leads me to wonder if this is purely more of a political issue. I hear some of what Brett's talking about as far as wanting things to be controlled at the local level, but from what I can tell, things are controlled at the local level. So that's where, when we start talking about abolishing a government department, well, why? What is it that we think the department is doing that's harmful? Is it not accomplishing its mission? Or do we just fundamentally disagree with that mission is? And then the question becomes, the things that it is charged with doing, then who adopts those things, especially when we talk about financial aid and things when we're talking about, that higher education. I have more thoughts, but I think I'll bring it up as we continue to discuss. But my big issue is what's broken about the department to the extent that we need to abolish it. That's what I'm not seeing. And I think the criticisms that I've heard quite often aren't things that are even being driven down from a federal level within school districts. So that's part of what I have issue with this particular solution to a problem that I don't know that exists.
Yeah, so this is where Thea and I disagree a little bit, but not ultimately. So for me, the first time that I started thinking like, okay, maybe we could do without this was like Common Core and No Child Left Behind. And those were times when I was like, okay, there's some things being pushed down that perhaps could be better dealt with at the local level. But I tend to agree with Thea that right now what we're talking about is not Common Core or the grading of schools and teaching to the test and that sort of thing. It seems like what we're talking about these days is school curricula, books, things like that, which are absolutely already controlled at the local level. That none of that is being pushed from the federal level down. And to the best of my understanding, the whole reason we have the Department of Education is because we used to have separate and not equal schools. And when the local level doesn't want to do things a certain way, when the local level wants to discriminate in certain ways, we needed a federal department to mandate that they not do that. And, you call me cynical if you want, but my thought is with most of federal oversight type things, that if you get rid of the oversight entirely, people will devolve to their worser angels, and we're just going to be having the same issues that we had, 70 years ago are just going to come back.
All right. Well, I think my my inner big libertarian is going to come out in this discussion, because I say axe it, and I say axe it primarily. So here's where I kind of start with this, and of course, I did my research as I usually do. I think I start with the federal government with this premise of departments, agencies, bureaus, what have you, should have to justify their existence. We shouldn't have to justify that they shouldn't exist in the federal government. I believe the U.S. Constitution is very much written that way, in that a lot of its language says if the powers are not expressly granted to the federal government here in this document, those powers belong to the states, the localities, and the people. And so that's kind of the premise that I start from. And so I go, well, right away, there's nothing in the Constitution about the Department of Education. So right there, it's not a ding against it, but it's kind of a, well, does it need to be at the federal level in the first place kind of thing. The second thing that I'll bring up, Thea, you were right. I was looking at the dollar amounts that are allocated and everything. So according to my research, and this comes from the NCES, and these are for $22-23. So they don't have the most current, but it's pretty recent. 11% of funding for elementary and secondary public schools comes from the federal level. 46% comes from the states, and then 44% from local sources. So that's your property taxes and stuff. So not sure how the different states contribute their portion, but it's close to half. So if you look at that, right, 11% from federal, that's not very big. And we are talking about dollar-wise and personnel-wise, the Department of Education is the smallest cabinet department in the federal government. So I think when people talk about, hey, let's cut the Department of Education, they're not thinking, hey, I'm going to take this huge cleaver to a huge chunk of fat that just exists in the federal budget. I think it's more about should we be doing this thing in the first place? And I'm reminded of a quote that I actually have on my social media profile by Peter Drucker, who says, there is nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency something that should not be done at all. Which also reminded me a lot of the work that I ended up doing at the Pentagon during my last tour.
But Dion, what is the thing?
What's the thing? So in my research, I was trying to figure out, and like you said, you were kind of having a hard time figuring out what is it that the Department of Education is doing, right? And I think that's part of my problem as well. What I found is that there are a lot of NAEP, that's National Association of Education Professionals, I think, basically national scorecards, right, for the country. And these go back to 1973. So just a little more than half a decade before the creation of the Department of Education itself. And they basically rank, how does our student proficiency rank against the rest of the world? And if you look at it, the latest data they have is from 2023. And I will grant that from 2020 to 2023 is a little bit of an outlier because we had COVID. But at the same time, when you're comparing us to other countries who also had a COVID pandemic going on, we still fell in relation to those other countries as well, right? So if the global pandemic truly affected every country, you would expect that our relative positioning against all those other countries would hopefully stay the same, but it actually dropped against other countries. And I have this in my notes, but basically I took an example, which was 13-year-old math performance. And in 1973, we had a score of 266 out of 500. And that put us at about like a rank of 24 amongst other countries. And last year, our score was 271. So in about 40 years of funding the Department of Education, we haven't changed in any statistically significant way in the way that we are producing good academics for our children.
But the Department of Education doesn't deal with any of that stuff anyway. I mean, it sounds like, and I don't necessarily disagree with you, you're saying the quality of the education isn't there, and therefore we shouldn't fund the Department of Education, but the Department of Education doesn't do curriculum. It doesn't do.
So what does the Department of Education do, right? Like, its budget is.
So, I mean, a lot of it is providing that, because even 11% is still, when you talk about overall, it's a lot of money. But a lot of it is like, it's talking about the equal opportunity programs, right? So I remember filling out the FAFSA, like, so I guess one of the things that I started thinking about this was like, what did my education do for me? And like, what did education mean for my family? So I grew up in a very like typical, with an immigrant mother who was like my grandfather came to the US, and his thing was my children and my grandchildren are going to get an education. And that was like, I'm the very stereotypical child of immigrant that had to have straight A's and all of those types of things, was very true. But at the same time, my parents were middle class, I would say lower middle class growing up. And I had an older sister. So when I hit 9th grade, it was, if you want to go to college, you need to get funding or find a scholarship. And I remember, hoping I could get money and trying to figure out how to navigate the FAFSA and fill out these forms and what was I eligible for as far as student aid was concerned. Ultimately, I went to the Air Force Academy, so the government still paid for my education, but through different means. And so I didn't actually have to get student aid, but that was something now. And I'm looking at, I have a 12-year-old, with this, when we decided to do this topic, I went online, and a lot of those instructions and how to do all that is through the Department of Education. Right. Now, I'm not saying that program couldn't be housed somewhere else, but it makes sense for it to be housed at the federal level because everybody doesn't go to school in their state, right? And so this is where you have people going, I went to high school in South Carolina, I went to college in Colorado, right? So that kind of thing. So that my question is with stuff like that, well, who does it? Like where are we putting that?
Who did it before the Department of Education? I think it was Housing and Urban Development, or Health and Human Services. I can't remember which.
Okay, so then that's the answer.
Yeah.
And then for stuff like special education, and, so I don't know with those types of funds and those programs, who else? I mean, are we saying everything goes back to HUD is what we're thinking?
Well, so you brought up like the college funding, the FAFSA and everything. And one of the things that I saw in my research this week was, now it was from the Cato Institute, right? So, you can take that with a grain of salt with the bias that they have. But they did a 2017 study that showed that tuition at colleges tends to rise at a rate of 60 cents per dollar of student aid that is given out by the federal government. And so basically, the purpose of trying to give student aid to college kids is to make college accessible for those who don't necessarily have the money to attend. But what colleges do is they go, oh, well, the federal government is guaranteeing, say $10,000 to the student. Well, I can hike up tuition a little bit because I know that they're going to receive that, and we'll make up for it some other way. So college tuition keeps going up, and then federal aid follows it, and it's just this steady climb of tuition increases.
The question, though,
are you saying that you think that if we stopped giving federal dollars for education, that colleges would stop raising their tuition?
Oh,
That's what I
no.
was about to ask.
I mean, I'm not right. I mean, college, let's be real, right? Even though colleges enjoy this not-for-profit sort of tax, whatever, I forget what rule it falls under, right? We all know that they are definitely for-profit institutions, all of them except for, I guess, the service academies, right? Because they can't be, but everything else, right? They are all for profit, whether they openly admit to that or not. So no, Will, I think that they will continue to want to get money, but if they know all of a sudden that a large portion of their student population could not afford what they're currently charging, they would either have to just cut enrollment rates, or they would have to reduce their tuition to maintain their enrollment rates, right?
I know, at least living in California, I don't think that's true. And I think actually, I guess to Brett's point, what that happens is just it means that you're going to end up with the state putting in more money if you're cutting the federal funding. And California, a lot of aid comes from the state of California for our universities anyway, at least for like our in-state students and whatnot. But I think the thing that bothers me about this topic is that I do think this isn't about, like, I don't think this is one where folks who seem to have an issue with the Department of Education, I don't think they're coming from where you're coming from Dion. And I guess this is where I feel like there's a disingenuous attack on this idea that the Department of Education is pushing a particular agenda. I really feel like this is just it's tied to a larger issue with public education in general, and I don't think it's about the role of the federal government in education. I think it's really about the tension of who gets to say in and people not liking the way that the education and schools are set up right now, right? Whether it be people who want to be able to have money, have the choice of whether they even send their child to public school and have access to those funds to send their child to, some alternative form of education, whether it be homeschool, charter schools, private schools, whatever. I feel like it's more about that than it is about people having a problem with what because we're all saying, I don't really know. I mean, what does it do? What doesn't it do? I agree with Will when we had the whole No Child Left Behind. I agreed with that was an overreach. But I think in the 20 years since then, we've seen a correction, from that. And we've learned, I say we as a whole. So I don't think that's the current state. And I don't think that's what's driving the pushback against this department. So I just wish we would have a conversation or focus the conversation on what we're really upset about, versus just making the scapegoat of we're going to cut this department. Because I don't think you get rid of the Department
Do you
of
want to have
Education.
that conversation now about what we're all really upset about?
And that's my fear, is that because it's showmanship, it's political. I think Thea had mentioned earlier, okay, fine, cut the Department of Education. All they're going to do is move what it does under HUD or HHS. It's going to keep on doing the exact same thing, and nothing's actually going to change for the things that people are upset about. But it's going to make them feel good that they stuck it to the Department of Education, even though it's not going to solve the problems that they see in their kids' education.
Well, there is some of that, but the main thing that I think people are wanting is just more control over their educational choices. And the thing is with the Department of Education is that when you look at that, 11% that they get, yes, 11% is a big chunk of funding. That affects a lot of different things, but it's one of those that schools have to meet specific federal requirements in order to receive those funds. And that's where some of the requirements may not meet the needs of the locality they represent. And so they might have, and I don't know what the stipulations and requirements are. I don't have that in my notes, but to have those requirements there, that changes things to where if you remove those barriers, you're going to have people that have a lot more freedom and choice of how they do things. Because at least for me, when I look at the education system, Thea, I agree with you. I don't think the Department of Education is the problem. And that's why my statement earlier was I don't think we should abolish it, but it needs a massive reform. But it's not just at the top down level. You have to start lower as well, because I don't know if you guys ever done any studies on the history of education in this country. The education system, the whole K through 12 mindset is based on the Prussian education system that went through and said, hey, all the kids are going to enter at a certain age. We're going to teach them a certain curriculum at a certain level, and we're going to take them through all the way steps so that when they graduate, they can go be good factory workers. That was the whole point, is that they were producing employees and soldiers, people who are really good at doing what they're told, right? The system that we have now is not designed to create free thinkers. Yes, free thinkers still come out of it, right? But that's usually they're the ones that are a little divergent from the system. They do things differently. They self-educate outside of the standard school curriculum, right? And so that's why I'm like talking with my son about, what's up?
They're a bug, not a feature.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the whole thing, right? And so when you look at the standard that comes out of our current system, we just get a lot of cogs. Right? We just get people that enter the system. The whole mantra of go to school, get good grades, get a good job, work for 40 years and retire. That may have been a great mantra for our grandparents. It doesn't work anymore because there's no corporate loyalty. There's no 40-year plan anymore.
Why do you say it doesn't work? Because when people say that, again, we're all biased by our own views. It worked for me. I'm still somebody who has done better than my parents, right? So I guess I'm a millennial that still has done significantly better financially than my parents did. So I've done better than my parents' generation. And for me, a huge part of that, is my education, right? I have a job that's directly linked to my level of education. And it started with my ability to get into the academy, then, finishing the academy, getting my bachelor's, my ability to get into grad school, getting my law degree. And so for me, I can draw a straight line from elementary school, and I went to public schools, right? I could draw a straight line through a lot of the programs that were available for me that, helped me elevate my position in life, right? And I'm not saying mine is the only path, but this idea that it doesn't work, what is that based on?
Well, and I'm not saying from that standpoint, because
Sorry, I just want to throw this out there, Brett, and then you can go ahead. So Thea, if I could ask, so if you had not gone to the Air Force Academy, or let's say you had not gone directly into active duty, and you had gotten the undergraduate degree that you got, what would your prospects have been on the outside with that degree? Would you have been in sort of a similar?
I think it's in that sense, I'm a bad example. I would have gone. The only reason I didn't go straight to law school is because I went to the academy, and I couldn't, because I went in at that time. I commissioned at a time where you couldn't directly go to law school out of the academy because we were involved in the wars.
I only say that because, going back to the original, or not the original, but an earlier point about how expensive college has gotten, I think a lot of kids are getting themselves into a lot of debt right now with degrees that are not necessarily going to pay the bills when they get out and they get into the workplace.
I agree with you on that one, right? I do a lot of mentoring with undergraduates, right? I started doing this when I was in law school, and I've stayed involved with a few different organizations. And one of the things I ask especially a freshman, what are you majoring in, and how is that going to get you a job on the other side, right? But there are definitely, but that is not equal across the board, right? So I think if somebody right now is in undergrad and says, I want to be a nurse and I'm going to get my BSN, they have a job waiting for them, because right now there's a shortage in nursing, right? There's a shortage, right? The job market for attorneys right now is great. There's definitely a number of careers in which you can get a degree and get a job. But I agree with you. And I think this was part of the problem with maybe our generation, where there were a lot of people that were going to college to find themselves. And this is kind of speaking to what Brett was talking about. And, remember, everybody was a psychology major, but nobody wanted to be a psychologist. It's like, so why are you majoring in that? What's that doing for you? Right. And I don't know. I remember, this was the whole debate in recent years about bringing back the emphasis on STEM. And we're talking about at the elementary, K through 12 levels, and really emphasizing the things that made America a superpower, I guess, or like made America great in the first place, right? Our ingenuity, our ability to invent things, our ability to create things, and focusing on those types of things in education. And I think that still can happen, right? And it doesn't always have to be like, to Brett's point, to steer children in the direction of what I do, right? Not everybody needs a graduate degree, and those degrees can be very expensive and all that. But I remember when I was in high school, they still had auto shop. And I used to think that was so cool. Like people would go in there and learn how to work on cars and all that. There's still ways where the model that we have can work for people. I'm not saying that it doesn't have flaws or there hasn't been misdirections at times, but this idea that schools are just not working and that you go through school, you just become a cog in the wheel and there's no value to it. I haven't seen that in my experience.
Well, and Thea, this is where the argument kind of gets taken off, because it seems anytime someone has a discussion around this stuff, somebody says one thing, oh, it's not working. The response is, oh, you mean we should totally just get rid of it? No, not at all. It just needs reform. Again, we're not trying to jump from one ditch to the other. Things just need to change. And that's the point of the conversation, is that when I say things aren't working, what I mean by that is we are producing people that they go through an entire system where they are taught what to think and not how to think. Critical thinking skills are an extremely low thing. Like, I mean, you look around at the world, like I see it all the time with people that I deal with, people learning how to solve their own problems and work through things. That is not the norm. That's an exception. Right. And Thea, I'm like you too. I grew up lower middle class. My dad was a mechanic. My mom was a school teacher. I lived on a dirt road until I was 13 years old. Right. They came through and finally did chip and seal on it, which isn't even real asphalt. But I mean, that's where I grew up, is out in the middle of the sticks. I had to do the same thing. I had to work my butt off in school to get good grades so that I could be competitive for scholarships, because I knew my parents didn't have the money for an education. Right. Yeah. I had to work through that same thing, too, which is, a whole nother point when people call out my privilege. Yeah, let's talk about that another time. I had to work for what I got, too. But when I talk about the system's not working, what I mean by that is that when you look at the fact that 65% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck and less than half of Americans have more than $1,000 in savings, yeah, they may have been able to go through school and get a job, but that job is not cutting it. And it's the whole idea where if the only thing you know how to do is earn a wage, your only hope is that someone will pay you a higher wage. But if you're actually taught to think critically and look at things differently, and you know how to create wealth, you can go out and do things differently. That's the ingenuity I'm talking about. That's where we can go back and teach that. And exactly what you're talking about with the auto shop thing, yes, specialized tracks, cater to the people, right? Don't have this blanket education that you have to go across. Actually give people the choice of where their money goes and what they want to do and how they want to educate. You'd be surprised that students are a lot more enthusiastic about what they learn when they're excited about what they're learning, and they don't just have to go through a bunch of generic crap in their classes because the system tells them they have to. That's the kind of change I'm talking about.
I guess, and that's where I think this conversation is different from the topic, but it's important. Because again, when we're like, we got to demolish or abolish the Department of Education, that doesn't get to anything you're speaking to, Brett. And that's the problem that I have, where when this is a topic, when it gets into the political arena, it just, we get completely off track, right? We have people at school board meetings wanting to get rid of Huckleberry Finn and get rid of, To Kill a Mockingbird, and not focusing on like, okay, what are the things that will prepare our kids to enter, adulthood and have more opportunities, right? And so that's where I appreciate having a real conversation about what should school curriculum look like, but it feels like the conversations we're having now is not about like, okay, should we emphasize STEM? Should we bring back liberal arts? Should we spend, should there be more options within any particular school system? It seems to only be about who gets the money. And the loudest voices from my perspective seem to always be people who want to pull their kids out for social reasons, right? This idea that I don't want my kid in these schools. I want to homeschool my kid. And when you ask them why, a lot of times from my perspective, it's not necessarily based on what Brett is discussing and like, oh, my kid doesn't have opportunities. Seems to be, again, these social, cultural wars that we're talking about. And that's where I get stuck and be like, I don't know. It frustrates me because I don't think that the solutions that people are proposing matches what the end goal should be.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that, Thea, because that's why I started my statement. Like, I don't think we should get rid of the Department of Education. It serves a purpose, but it needs change. And when you can give more power down to the people, at least what I've seen, whenever you have a larger government oversight of anything, people naturally take the bystander effect, right? Oh, that's not my problem. Someone else will handle it. Well, when you start to realize that your school's policies and education, the curriculum that's there, everything that goes into it in terms of property taxes, I mean, that's a whole discussion too, right? Like, people that pay property taxes, especially like because we live in an area, right, where they're talking about building a new high school to give greater opportunity, newer education, newer technology to facilitate education, right? Well, the area that I live in, it's an aging population. Most of them, their kids are already in high school, so they're not worried about the next generation. So they didn't pass the bill, right? Now, I know by the time they build the high school, my kids might be there. I don't know, right? But the point is, I understand the value of a community. So therefore, I'm going to vote yes on that because I think it's a good idea. Do I want to pay more taxes? No. But if I'm going to pay taxes to a system that educates people and provides opportunity, I'm all for that. But I think people need to get more involved in stuff. And when you have this larger oversight, people just tend to pass the buck more. And that's where I'm thinking that the change needs to happen where, again, everything's tied together. We talk about this every time. You can't go into one area and not into another because there's a whole pervasive mindset about how people operate on a daily basis that affects everything we do. And yes, it starts with the processes that we learn through our school systems. But a lot of that needs shifting.
I mean, I guess the thing is, one of the issues that brought about, 1980, they created the department. And a lot of that was because even in 1980, you had school districts that were not adhering to the decision in Brown v. the Board of Education, right, that desegregated schools. And so you still had these situations where schools were not, integrated, that they were still not providing equal opportunity to different students and being exclusionary and discriminatory. So that was part of how we got to having a federal department in the first place. That's where I worry that, I understand what you're saying about oversight, but I do also think, like what Will said earlier, when you don't have the oversight is where a lot of these things can go unchecked within communities and when no one's looking. And, maybe some states have robust oversight. California the state is very involved in curriculum and everything, much more so than the federal government when it comes to California schools. And I don't know if that's for better or worse. I literally just had an issue with my daughter's 7th grade math because they dictated a particular curriculum that it's been terrible. And now the teachers have basically said they're going to go back to what they were doing before. So I agree with too much oversight can be a problem. But I worry about certain types of populations that then end up being disenfranchised because of a lack of oversight,
Yeah. And that's where I was saying that the federal government still has the ability to step in through that to where they can go through and do things like, the funding and grants, making sure that we do have Title I grants and the Disabilities Education Act and stuff like that. There's still things they can do. They can not necessarily like standardized testing or accountability, but having something like that where, I don't know, because honestly, I don't know about you guys. I hated taking standardized tests as a kid. Yeah. They didn't prove much. They didn't do much. But, there's areas where they can still have influence, right? And that's where I said where they can not have mandates, but they can still have targets or, standards that they can kind of shoot for. And that's where I think the federal government can help with that. And then they can also make sure that we don't have those marginalized groups that completely get overlooked. But the amount of funding that we're putting into it, $60 billion a year, do we really need to have that level put into it? Yeah. That's where we need to look and change.
$238 billion a year is the Department of Education's budget, at least as of last year.
Yeah, the $60 billion, I think, is the funding that goes back to the K through 12.
Yeah, that's the same with the breakdown. Yeah.
So if you look at that, right, Dean, what did you say? $238 billion
is for the department. Yep.
But we're only paying $60 billion to schools. What's the rest of it going to? You look at the administrative costs that are there. You look back from, I think it was either somewhere in the 90s. I don't know if it was 90 or 96, but you look at the amount of students that have been added to the system. It's gone up by 96%, but administrative staff and costs have gone up by 700%.
Yep.
I guess
that was since 1950.
That's what it was. Yeah.
While we were talking, that I was looking up the 10% that the department gives to the schools is for disadvantaged students, gifted classes, remedial classes. Like it's for the schools that don't have the funding needed if you're using it based on property taxes, or the state isn't funding them well enough. It's stepping in to make sure that all the students have equal access to education. It's not, so to Thea's point, like that 10% is still a lot of money. And if you take that away, okay, now who's going to pick up the tab for those types of programs? Not that you couldn't do that from HHS or HUD or someone else anyway, but they are needed.
I guess I think my overall theme is like what the things that I could find that the Department of Education actually does are things that are needed. That's kind of where the theme that I came with. So that's where I was like, why is this a talking point other than for politics? But I think, Will, you touched on something that is a larger issue when we talk about like the role of government and different services that it provides. I'm in the camp. I don't agree with the whole idea that your level of education should be tied to the property taxes of where you live. This idea of having failing schools and schools that are under resourced, I've always had an issue with that, because that it means that those who have the least among us also have the least opportunity through education. And that to me, that's part of what perpetuates the certain cycles. One of the things, Brett, you talked about with schools, the reality is like where I live. So Dion, I live right by Miracosta. I don't know if you ever saw I live down the street from this high school that looks like a college campus. Like it is ridiculously resourced. It's a really nice school. So those types of programs with STEM and tech and engineering. I mean, you could take Chinese, you could take Spanish, you could take, there's just so many things that school has to offer. But you go, 20 miles east, and that's not the same in East LA, right? And so there you have, like, you're perpetuating that the haves have more, and then the have-nots don't have the same opportunities. And I've always had a problem with that. And I think that's where I.
So how do we fix that? How do we fix that? Because, I've thought about that for a while, and, okay, as a libertarian, I am very much against the coercion of taxes, right? Because basically I feel like a lot of my money is taken out to pay for a lot of things that I simply don't agree with. I'm not opposed to all taxation. I just look at how much of my paycheck comes out and what we as America waste money on, right? Studies that looked into like how frogs are turning gay and things like that. You could see like all these different, the waste of the week. There's like a blog that's like the federal waste of the week, and it's stuff like that, right? And so okay, and I think about, well, it would be nice if we could somehow redirect funding, right? Redistribute income to those places that need it, because I also recognize that our nation as a whole benefits from an overall, at least minimally educated populace, right? Like not everybody's going to be Einstein, but if everybody can achieve a certain minimum level of education, then everybody knows how to like do their taxes, and everybody knows how to do basic like math at work, and they can answer the phone and read and write, things like that. That all contributes to the economy. So I get that, and I want to contribute to that. But, what, as a homeowner, right, what is one of the main things that goes into my calculus of buying a home? Even when before I had kids, it was the school district, right? In Colorado Springs, I did not have children, but I made darn sure to buy a house in D20 because that is the premier school district in Colorado Springs, and that's where the houses have the best resale value.
I was about to say, it drives up the cost of homes and the value of homes. Because same thing, I live in Redondo Beach, right? I live in one of the beach cities, and people, like, you can literally drive 5 minutes to Lawndale, but the cost, and you will cross one street and homes will go down $1 million, $1 million, because you're no longer in one of the beach cities, right? And it's not that the houses look that different, or that you're in such a different neighborhood. It's that you're in this school district when you cross over. Inglewood Ave is the street I'm talking about, right? And it's crazy, and I guess you say how you would fix it. I really thought about this because another podcast, Trevor Noah has a podcast, and they had, like, if you were king or queen for a day, and this was what one of the hosts brought up. I didn't like their solution, but basically it was a version, I guess an altered version of what they said was you basically create either a pool of, like, funding comes from the state across all counties, or from the county level or the state level. I would argue, depending on the state, you would have to figure out what makes more sense, because I think if you have rural counties and smaller states, maybe it needs to come from the state level, like all your state taxes is, and then, like, property taxes or whatever. You have to look at some way to figure out at what level it's distributed and maybe not be as localized. Or you
should we do it nationally?
Yeah, I don't think nationally is the
answer. You need a Department of Education to do that.
I think because here's Democrat giving credit to what the Republic. I agree with Brett. I think if you did this at a national level, you will not get the results you're looking for.
If we siphoned funds out of California, which has the same wealth as like if California was its own country, it would be the 6th wealthiest country in the world. If we siphoned funds from California to pay for, like, Arkansas schools, Wyoming, Californians would get pissed.
Yes, of course, because I pay, like, that's why I think, like, for me in California, the county level feels more comfortable, right? I mean, LA County is huge, but I would still feel okay across the board. Okay, if it's at the county level, then you're going to get more equity where you're not crossing half a mile. And this is for people who don't know LA, I think, or Los Angeles County. First of all, when people talk about LA, they're really talking about LA County. LA City is not actually that big. And it's like 50 cities that exist in LA County, and they're all resourced differently, and they're really small, even though they have high populations, right? And so across the county, I think it would make a difference to have more equity, right? Because in LA County, you have Beverly Hills and Malibu, and then you have, Compton, although it's $1 million for a house in Compton, you know what I mean? By the way, it's $1 million for a house in Compton. Just side note, that's mind blown, But
so just to that point, Thea, I mean, that's because we have federalism. That's how Florida does it. Florida is by county. All of our school districts are by county. But Florida was also just did this huge school voucher program, and it's like $8,000 a year that no needs testing, no anything. Anyone can take this $8,000 coupon. And what they found, though, was that all it did was subsidize the rich families that were already sending their kids to private schools. They took these coupons, and now they didn't have to pay as much out of pocket. The kids that were going to public school remained in public school, but just had far less funding for those schools available because Dion, to your point, like the 40-ish% that comes from the state of Florida said, well, we're gonna allocate that differently. We're gonna give these vouchers so that people could choose what school they want to go to. And I think that's the challenge with all of these. Brett, I take your point that parents should have more say in where their kids go to school, which would therefore dictate what is taught at that school, that sort of thing. But as soon as you start chipping away, I mean, the only reason that public education works is because it's public, that everybody pays into it and everybody goes there. When you start chipping away at that, there's less to go around. We can't fund public education for everyone if half the people don't want to pay into it and don't want to go there.
I mean, it's the same argument that was behind the public mandate for the Affordable Care Act, right? And that's where I agree with you. Like, ironically, Florida is pretty high as far as like rankings for public education. So perhaps just having it at the county level may be working better for them than in other states. But the whole where you start pulling people out of the basket or pulling funds out of that pot of money, then yeah, you're diluting it, right? And so, because the overhead is probably still the same for that school, but now less money is coming in. So I think you do have to perhaps what we're not seeing is the responsiveness of schools to like what Brett is talking about when it comes to, well, what is it that we're teaching? What are our goals? What are we achieving with these programs and this programming? I think that's where the rub is, right? When you talked about like being a critical thinker, Brett, you know, I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that, right? Because I look at like Jocelyn's science class, her 7th grade science class, and some of the assignments that she's had, and I definitely think it is encouraging her to like think differently and understand systems and you know how these different things work. She's also taking an engineering like kind of it basically is an engineering class, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. You're doing that in 7th grade. So I don't know if it's that kids aren't being taught, but I don't know what it is across the country. In that sense, I'm not an expert. I don't know if that's true of every school because I am fortunate enough to be in a quote unquote good school district, and my kids go to quote unquote good schools.
Yeah, and I mean, critically thinking is not necessarily engineering skill sets. It's not the STEM stuff.
No,
that is a part of it for sure.
That's an example of a class where she had to figure, like, I'm helping her with her homework, and I'm having to like go through the process of her trying to figure something out and her having to think, well, what makes sense, right? Because it was a project where there wasn't necessarily one right way to do it, and she had to figure out what made sense in order to get to figure out these problems. And I was like, oh, that's cool, right? Like that's something that I don't remember having assignments like that.
Yeah, and that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about, Thea, is like if we saw more of that, that would be a great example, right? But of course, it doesn't just go there. I mean, trust me, I have plenty of thoughts around the school system on what we could teach. I mean, Dion mentioned one, making sure that people actually know how to pay their taxes, right?
I agree with that.
You know, wanting, how do you actually balance your budget? Here's an idea. Why don't we teach a class on self-image and self-reliance, you know, things like that. We actually help people graduate with a self-value and a self-worth rather than just a piece of paper, right? We teach interpersonal skills, like how to have friendships, how to develop relationships with people, like all these things that are actual life skills that should be taught rather than some of the extracurricular stuff that gets put out there.
I mean, the thing, though, that I think a lot of teachers will say, though, but like they're struggling to teach people how to read, you know, how to just do basic math, like just, you know, the basics are some schools and some students are struggling to get there, that you're talking like the next level up. And so it's kind of how do you balance that? And I, you know, this is where when I do talk to educators, I hear their frustration because not every kid's walking in there with the same capacity. Not every kid has, you know, a lot of kids have other issues at home that they bring into school that affects their ability to learn. So that we do put a lot of pressure on schools and teachers to accomplish a lot of things. And I guess one of the last things I'll say, the thing that has always bothered me is that we have no problem funding jails. We have no problem funding prisons and the criminal justice system.
Haven't we privatized jails?
Yeah, but it's not like, but taxpayer dollars are still paying for those privatized jails, right? So like when we say private, we're just paying a private company to do, you know. So my issue is like we have no problem finding that money, and this is one where I'll make the opposite argument of what I was making last week, in the sense that this is one area where I've always looked at all the money we spend here and think, what if we spent that same money at the front end, and maybe those same people would have a different outcome if they were invested in when they were 5 instead of when they're 50 sitting in a jail cell. And the school to prison pipeline is a real thing. So that's another issue as far as priorities and how we allocate funds for schools. I think we could.
I will bring up something that so for our listeners and viewers who probably don't know, I briefly toyed with the idea of running for school board a couple years ago now, and I got into the race, got onto the ballot, and then realized that it would be a full-time job to be on the school board, and I already work a full-time job, and the school board doesn't pay enough to pay my bills, so I had to drop out of the race. But in my in starting my campaign there, one of the things that I researched was I live in Fairfax County in Virginia, which is in Northern Virginia, just outside of DC, and it's one of the best school systems in the nation. And on average, we spend about almost $17,000 per pupil for education. And I found at least 5 private schools whose tuition is lower than that, but still produces much better, college acceptances, SAT, ACT scores, whatever metric you want to use, whether it's graduation rate, whether it's GPA, whatever it is, it's all better compared to the public school system. So I don't think that money in and of itself, like spending more money on the problem, is necessarily going to fix it, because we have been doing that, unfortunately. And I think this is a part of government inefficiency, as Brett alluded to earlier. Since 1950s, we've had a 96% increase in the student population, but a 702% increase in the administrative staff. And of course, the administrators in the school system are the ones that get paid the most, which also means that they have the most expensive benefits package and retirement. And so what we've done is, as we have steadily increased the amount of funding that we give to the schools year on year, even adjusted for inflation, we are doing so inefficiently because we're not putting the money where it belongs. That money is not going to directly benefit the student. The money is not going directly to hire more teachers. It's buying more administrators. So we need to fix that for sure.
One thing I want to push back on that you just said, that I've heard a lot of, when people talk about, well, private schools have better outcomes than public schools and based on money. But one of the things that folks don't always account for is one of the biggest correlations on whether someone is going to, graduate, test well, go to college, all these other things. It directly correlates with the wealth and education of their parents, right? So in private schools, you're much more likely to have those college educated or high income, high earning parents that are then providing the resources for their kids, including sending them to private schools.
Well,
so
and that's why That's why I limited my research just to Fairfax County, which as of last year was like the 4th wealthiest county in the nation. And so I was only comparing it to the schools in Fairfax County and comparing the amount we spend on pupils versus the tuitions of various private schools in the area. I will also mention I know you guys know this, but I will mention for our listeners and viewers that as I was getting ready to retire from the Air Force, I thought, I wanted to stay in public service. And so I thought I would become a high school teacher. I'm actually certified here in the state of Virginia to teach physics and technology education. And I spent the last 6 months on active duty getting my teaching certification, which included doing substitute teaching. So I spent about 6 months in the classroom, including I did a long-term sub gig at one of the local high schools, which meant that, it just so happened to work out that after spring break, their teacher was offered a promotion to go work at the administrative building as like an IT person. And so he wanted to take that promotion, and they needed a teacher to come in and take over. So I had that experience, and I do have to say, physics is one of those classes in high school that, one, is it's optional, it's not required, and two, requires at least some basic understanding of math. I had quite a few students who could not do basic algebra to do our physics problems. And I was like, I don't know how I can teach you physics if you don't understand the math, because it has to be just assumed that you know the math so that we could do F equals MA. And of course, the reason why I did not become a teacher is because, I was coming off of a 20-year Air Force career. I was at a certain point in my life financially. I owned a house, and I have a child, and we live in an expensive area. And I was like, well, I'll have my retirement check coming in, so I don't need to make a lot of money. But the best they could offer me was going to leave me $2,000 a month short of where I was on active duty. And I was like, you guys don't have the flexibility in your hiring to take somebody who spent 20 years as an engineer who wants to teach physics, right? So that is a direct correlation. Like I could bring in real world experience to the students, and plus I have a passion for it. I love it. They were like, sorry, our hiring just won't let us do that. This is the best we can offer you.
I mean, and you mentioned as far as like some of the differences between U.S. school systems and international. But some of it is, the standard of living and what we pay teachers versus what other countries, how they pay and how they treat their educators. Like it's interesting. My mom grew up in Trinidad. She came to the U.S. as a teenager. And I remember going to Trinidad with her, and there was this woman, Miss White, when we were walking down the street, and it was her teacher, her like elementary school teacher. And everybody knew this woman. She was 90, but like she lived in this like big house on the corner, and everyone's like, oh, she got the government retirement. And, like you could live well back in the day in Trinidad as a teacher. And like she did, she had this like lovely house that had this like balcony. So as we're walking by, she's like, she comes down, and I was like, this is your teacher's house? Like, what did her husband do? They're like, oh, no. But, she was a teacher. She got that good government, retirement. And I was like, really? But there, it's just a different system, and it was the way that teachers were revered, right? Like for my mom, here's this woman all these years, my mom is 60, about to be, well, I won't say my mom's age, but my mom was born in the 50s, right? And I don't feel like we've ever had that reverence, that level of reverence for teachers. And that I don't know. I mean, we know that's always an issue with pay. You see, when I was in 7th grade, my teachers went on strike. I had to cross the picket line. I remember that. And I had no idea what that meant, but I had subs for like, I think it was a week in San Diego. The teachers went on strike, and we had to like cross the picket line every day, that kind of thing. And I see strikes going on now. So maybe that's part of the issue, right? We're not, because we don't value it, or like what you're saying, maybe the money that is going into schools, it may be disproportionately allocated to the administration of schools, then you're not creating an incentive to having more teachers and the best quality teachers, right? That have a lot of maybe bringing life experience into the classroom that speaks to what Brett's talking about as far as like, from what perspective are you teaching students, right? And especially at different levels, when you're talking about high school, sometimes having life experience that you're bringing into the classroom can benefit depending on the subject that you're teaching.
I mean, life experience carries a lot. I mean, I saw that going through college. I mean, Dion, you as an engineer probably saw this as well, right? You had those teachers that were engineers that actually went and did that and came back to teach. And they were always better than the guys who got straight A's in school and then came back to teach the next year. I had a mentor in life that he explained it to me very well to me. He's like, A students teach B students how to work for C students. It was just kind of how it worked out.
Yeah. In law school, you see it because there's a whole like academia, like law school professors. And I love my law school professors. If any of you guys are listening, thank you for everything you did for me. But some of the professors that I had, you could, now that I'm in practice, I'm like, I could tell they never set foot in a courtroom, right? They had a very academic approach to practicing law, and that doesn't necessarily translate when you're in practice. Like you need to understand what happens when you go to court if you're a litigator like myself. Now there's a little tension. So I feel like if I ever went back and taught, because I practiced for now a number of years, I would have a different experience, a different perspective that I would teach to students. And the professors that I had that had practiced and they had an expertise based on their career, it was like night and day. So I agree with you, Brett, on that one. As we're bashing Will, who taught at the college level. So
we're just over an hour here. So we should probably get into what's been making us happy this week. And I think I'm going to start with you, Will, because I feel like you've been cut off a couple of times this discussion. Or give you the opportunity to talk.
No, it's all good. I'm a little under the weather. I told you all as we were getting on. I think Brett gave it to me this week. We're both not feeling great. Real quick, I did want to say, I don't know if you guys saw in the news, but MIT started offering free undergrad if you make less than $200,000 a year. So, to our discussion earlier about for-profit, all the universities are for-profit. It was interesting to see MIT do that. What's making me happy this week, though, I'll kind of recap it's the same discussion we were having before. So apparently I like treasure hunting. So there was a book published this week. It just came out called "There's Treasure Inside," and apparently this millionaire hid 5 boxes throughout the United States full of treasure, and then wrote a book with clues and treasure maps and all kinds of stuff so that you can go find the treasure. Now, I will say it's a little. There's some philosophical parts, it's the journey, not the destination, that type of thing. And I could see, a lot of people are excited about the book, and there's a lot more people hiking the Appalachian Trail because apparently one of the treasure boxes is there. But it's been, even if, presuming nothing ever comes of it, that I don't find any of these treasure boxes. It's fun to read, and I'm learning about the pieces of treasure and about the Appalachian Trail and Henry David Thoreau and all kinds of stuff. And that's what's making me happy.
Nice. Brett?
That's probably the standard for me. It usually has to do with my kids. When you got 4 of them, you spend a lot of time with them, right?
I hope so.
They take up a significant portion of my life. That's for sure. And I love doing that. Tonight we had a chance to go to one of my daughter's classmates' birthday party. And so, it's a thing from my childhood. It doesn't seem to be as popular these days, but they went to a skating rink, like the old, 1980s, early 90s, skating. I remember as a kid, we went to skate country in Tucson, Arizona. That was the place to go for your birthday parties. And so it was kind of neat. I got to go do that. But my son's getting out there. Excuse me. But my son's getting out there, and at first he's kind of going, he's working his way around. But by the end of it, he's making laps. He's not falling down. I love his attitude when he comes off, because he's like, man, I was one of the best skaters out there tonight. And I'm like, yeah, okay, buddy. All right. You did good. I'm not trying to crush his dreams or anything, but it's hey, have a little humility here, man. It's fun watching that level of confidence of him being out there for, an hour and a half skating, and now he's excited about it. And then I reminded him, dude, you do have a pair of roller skates at home. We can do this more often.
Did you skate?
I did not tonight, just because I had my daughters with me as well. And so my 4-year-old was there. And so I was trying to teach her how to skate and trying to skate while showing her how to skate. I'm like, we're both going down. So I'm just going to walk next to her.
That's cool. Okay, so I'll go. After I finished law school, so I went to law school after my Air Force career. And so I was in my 30s. And after I finished law school, I worked for a federal judge as a clerk at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeal in, we were housed in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And there were 4 clerks that we were all from different places, kind of very similar to this mix where we were just from 4 different locations, 4 different walks of life. And we all worked for our judge for a year. And one of the guys I clerked with, his name was Adam Hirsch. And this week he was on Jeopardy on Friday, and he won. And he had texted the rest of us. We've kept in touch over the years since we worked for our judge. And he was like, "I'm going to be on Jeopardy." And if you guys could watch, he's the champion right now. I don't know if an episode will come on tonight because at least for me, Monday Night Football's on. But if you guys are watching or listening to this, root for Adam. He's a current Jeopardy champion. It brought me so much joy to watch him on there because he's exactly the kind of guy that should be on Jeopardy, who just knows random things. And he's just a super smart person, but he's really nice. And he made my time in Albuquerque a little bit better. So it's making me happy that my friend won Jeopardy. So,
wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. For me, it was a fairly rare occasion these days, which is unfortunate. But, it takes prior planning. I guess that's what happens when you're a middle-aged parent is you have to plan date night, and you have to do it a month or so in advance. But I got tickets for me and my wife to go see Pentatonics, their Christmas concert.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. We went out to we got some Thai food before we went to the concert, and the concert was at Eagle Bank Arena at George Mason University, which is not that big. I think it holds like, I don't know, 10,000 people, something like that. It's not huge, but it was nice. Our seats were not very close to the main stage, but halfway through the concert, they moved to this like smaller stage right in the middle. And then they were almost directly in front of us. And among all the different songs, Christmas songs that they did, they were all beautiful. But of course, they did their signature Hallelujah. And it was, I mean, I don't know. I could have sworn that acapella was on that website, Stuff White People Like, because but I looked on there. I didn't see it on there, but I don't know if you guys remember that website, Stuff White People Like, because I looked around the crowd and I was like, wow, there's a lot of old white people here, but. But it was an amazing concert. Definitely recommend everybody like go see them if you can. It's absolutely amazing. And the female singer, Christine, I think her name is, she's pregnant, like very pregnant. I don't know how far along she is, but I was thoroughly impressed that she was still like walking around, dancing around, doing all this like in heels. A lot of I was like, wow, okay, that is amazing. But absolutely excellent concert. We had such a great time.
Awesome.
You better hope she's pregnant, Dion. You've made the cardinal mistake.
She said she was pregnant. She said she was expecting. Because this was not just like, this wasn't just like, ooh, I would like, is she pregnant or is that a burrito grande? No, this was like, if she wasn't pregnant, she was full on smuggling a basketball out of there. All right. So that I think will do it for tonight's episode. I don't think that we actually solved anything, although I think we all agreed we're not entirely sure that the Department of Education does something in particular that necessitates it to be there. At the very least, it should be reformed. I still contend that we don't need an entire department, but I don't think we came to consensus on that. And we certainly didn't come to consensus on how to fix our education system so that it's better for everybody.
You mean
we might have to revisit this
in 1 hour?
We might have to revisit this topic some other time and really dive down into how do we get a better education system for all of our kids, because I think we all agree that that is a worthwhile goal. So we will not be recording next week because next week is Thanksgiving. And so we are all going to be enjoying time with our friends and our families and hopefully not discussing politics during that weekend. There may be some not in episode posts that come out in the next week or so, but we will take a week off and we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. So thank you again. Like and subscribe and share us with your friends and family, and we'll see you next time. Bye.